Home to the world's singular superpower, the two continents that make up the Western Hemisphere are contrasts of each other. While North America will be preoccupied with internal matters, the affairs in the South will be shaped by the crisis in Venezuela. So here's what we need to be watchful for in 2019. I'm your host Shivan and welcome to Caspian Report. Going into the year, Donald Trump faces a complicated presidency. The Democrats lead the House of Representatives and are unlikely to go along with the controversial policies of the Trump administration. This political division will shape the agenda of the White House regarding tax cuts and immigration, but it will also affect military spending and foreign policy. Having said that, there are still issues in which Trump can bypass US lawmakers, and he could use such points as a bargaining chip to navigate the politically divided landscape. Furthermore, in 2019, America's present growing economic cycle is nearing its end. With the stock market up, interest rates on the rise, and with falling energy prices and low unemployment, one of the longest periods of economic growth in America is entering its closing phase, and bills are coming due. When the recession does strike, which is still a few years away, it will send shockwaves throughout the globe. In the meantime, foreign policy-wise, Washington will have its hands full in 2019. In Eastern Europe, a new arms race with Russia will start to take shape. In the Middle East, the White House will lead a new anti-Iran campaign, while in Asia-Pacific, the trade war with China is set to alter the status quo in the continent. Meanwhile, in South America, the regional nations will look to Washington to deal with the crisis in Venezuela as it spills over to the rest of the continent. Although domestic in origin, the crisis in Venezuela has a global significance. The desperate need for cash has forced the Maduro government to seek revenues from illicit activities. As a result, Venezuelan criminal groups that deal in illegal mining, drug trafficking, and other illicit activities have expanded their cross-border operations into neighboring Colombia and Brazil. This comes atop the millions of Venezuelans that have taken refuge in the neighboring states. Evidently, the flow of refugees and the increasing presence of criminal groups affects the internal affairs of other nations. Hence, Maduro's fight for survival, which started out as a domestic crisis, is now extending to the wider periphery of South America. Colombia and Brazil, which have taken the largest hit in the spillover, strongly oppose Maduro. However, since Bogota and Brasilia have no political or economic leverage on Caracas, most of the South American nations are likely to follow Washington's lead. In this context, the Trump administration is likely to consider to apply sanctions on the state-owned oil firm of Venezuela and to place the country on the state sponsors of terrorism list, while Trump's most extreme option on the table is the use of military force. All three options are ill-advised. Adding Venezuela to the terrorism list would greatly complicate matters for the opposition, while sanctions would hurt American refineries and businesses since the United States is the largest importer of Venezuelan crude oil. Simultaneously, using military power to overthrow Maduro would create a power vacuum that would ignite far larger hostilities. So to deal with the crisis, Trump will have to get creative. An additional consideration in Venezuela are the interests of Russia and China. Besides the notion of foreign strategic bombers and port rights, Caracas ships most of its crude oil to Moscow and Beijing as a means to pay down its staggering debt. What's more is that due to the government's inability to pay its employees in the oil industry, whenever workers quit, they take equipment and vehicles with them, leaving the oil fields inoperable. As a result, oil exports from Venezuela have dropped by half over the past 2 years, just under 1 million barrels per day. Of this total sum, China receives at least 463,000 barrels per day, while Russia imports about 176,000 barrels per day. Now, this may sound a lot, but both parties were promised nearly double that amount. Either way, the opposition in Venezuela does not recognize Maduro's loan agreements with Moscow and Beijing, because it enables the Russians and the Chinese to claim a stake in Venezuela's oil industry. Still, Maduro's dealings have bought him important allies in Russia and China, even though his government is deprived of revenues. In 2019, the crisis in Venezuela is likely to take a turn for the worse. Global and regional powers have vested significant stakes in the country. America and its allies will seek Maduro's exit, while Russia and China will try to prevent or delay it. The key to this struggle is the allegiance of the Venezuelan military. So, over the course of 2019, Maduro will seek to maintain the favor of the armed forces, while the opposition will try to persuade military units to switch camps. Either way, Maduro's exit is likely to be violent, chaotic, and amplify beyond the borders of Venezuela. Elsewhere in the Americas, the Mexican president, best known by his initials AMLO, will focus on domestic reforms. As part of his campaign promise, AMLO and his coalition pledged to increase wages, reduce poverty, and to combat corruption and crime across the country. These issues will dominate the Mexican headlines in the coming years, but the president has also raised proposals to reduce the country's trade dependency on the United States and to adjust energy legislation. Having said that, the Mexican government is not looking to upset its northern neighbor, and is therefore likely to continue to cooperate on issues like stemming the flow of refugees from Central America. Perhaps AMLO's most groundbreaking proposal is to lift the constitutional restrictions on legally binding referendums. In Mexico's corruption-ridden political environment, such constitutional changes would open the door to various lobbying groups with special interests, and thereby place the private sector in uncharted waters. Needless to say, AMLO's reforms in regard to binding referendums would have a profound long-term impact on the country. In Canada, politicians and citizens will prepare for a showdown at the federal elections in October 2019. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his Liberal Party will go head-to-head with the Conservative Party. Complicating the election is the fact that Trudeau is working on a trade agreement with China, which is likely to raise criticism by Canadian opposition as well as lawmakers from the United States. What's more is that at the background of the trade negotiations, Mexico, Canada, and the United States are supposed to ratify the new NAFTA agreement. Technically, Trudeau can still proceed with the trade agreement with China, but it will create frictions nevertheless. Besides Canada, elections will also be held in Panama, El Salvador, Guatemala, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Argentina. In South America's largest nation, President Jair Bolsonaro will seek to reform the economy by diversifying the country's trade partners. China is set to play an important role in this plan. More specifically, due to the trade war between Washington and Beijing, the export of goods is set to diminish. This gives Brazilian firms the commercial opportunity to fill those gaps in trade. So in 2019, Brazil will have to walk a fine line between American and Chinese interests. At the same time, in pursuit of trade diversification, the Brazilian government is exploring for ways to boost economic activity with Chile and Peru by the Pacific, which will come at the expense of Argentina. In the long term, as the trade dependency between Brazil and Argentina weakens, the geopolitical rivalry between these two nations will gradually reawaken. For Argentina, 2019 withholds additional hardships. President Macri is facing an uphill battle to win the general election scheduled for October 2019. The president's public approval is questionable. When Macri took office in 2015, he promised a new era of economic liberalization and growth. Public expectations were high, but the opposite unfolded when the value of the peso plummeted. In turn, this forced the government to request a loan from the IMF. Now, the IMF austerity measures have generated public backlash, and Macri's odds of winning re-elections are looking dim. That being said, the opposition isn't exactly an appealing choice either. Recently, a federal judge incriminated the leading opposition candidate on corruption charges. Thus, with two poor choices, the Argentinian public is heading towards uncertain times. Altogether, in the Americas, newly elected leaders will look for ways to fulfill campaign promises, while others will prepare for electoral votes themselves. At the same time, the endemic crisis in Venezuela is set to go global, which will encourage foreign intervention over the course of the year. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Special thanks to our top contributors on Patreon for making this report possible. If you haven't yet subscribed to our channel, now would be a great time to do so. Just remember to click on the gray bell icon to enable notifications. For inquiries on our crowdfunding platform, visit patreon.com/CaspianReport. Thank you for staying with us, and Sarol.